In 5 minutes, Luisa Flores disappeared, in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of people, and the person responsible, he was right there, holding the girl's mother's hand, crying beside the father. Sometimes the monster doesn't need to hide in the shadows. He is already sitting at your family's dinner table. Luisa! Mariella's scream tore through the air of the Acapulco beach that January afternoon in 1997. Once, twice, 3 times, the name echoed among the ice cream stands, the colorful umbrellas, the towels scattered across the hot sand. But the 8-year-old girl in the yellow dress didn't answer, because she was no longer there. Let's go back just 15 minutes in time. That morning the sun shone over the crystal-clear waters as if Acapulco were the paradise promised in postcards. Luisa Flores ran through the sand with a pink shell in her hand, her treasure of the morning, found among the rocks near the water. Her brown hair flew in the wind. Her laughter was so loud it mixed with the sound of the waves crashing on the beach. She smelled of sunscreen and salt water, and her happiness was so pure it made every adult around remember when the world still seemed simple. The Flores family wasn't rich, but they had conquered something valuable: stability. Ernesto worked at the front desk of a 5-star hotel, dealing with tourists arriving in search of the Mexican sun. Mariela taught children Luisa's age at a public school in the neighborhood, and that beach Sunday was sacred, a ritual they repeated whenever possible, an island of normality in a city that, in the late 90s, was starting to appear on the news for dark reasons. The sound of the beach was a chaotic symphony, children screaming with joy diving into the waves, street vendors announcing fish tacos and cold coconuts, salsa music playing at some distant kiosk, the constant jingling of an ice cream cart's bell. It was that bell that attracted Luisa. She showed the pink shell to her mother, who smiled and suggested putting it in the backpack. Then the girl saw the colorful cart stopped, about 50 meters away. She looked at Mariela with that pleading look every child knows. "You can go, but don't take long," said the mother, reaching for her wallet in her bag. Luisa dashed across the sand. Her little feet left quick marks that the wind would soon erase. Mariela saw her get close to the cart, saw other children lining up, saw the normal movement of a crowded summer beach. Then she turned her eyes back to her bag for just a few seconds. 2:23 p.m. Luisa buys a strawberry popsicle. 2:25 p.m. A witness sees her walking toward the parking lot, eating the ice cream. 2:28 p.m. Mariela looks up and doesn't find her daughter. 2:30 p.m. The first screams. The name Luisa repeated with growing despair. 2:35 p.m. Dozens of people searching for a girl in a yellow dress. 2:42 p.m. Ernesto drops the water bottles upon hearing his wife scream. 3:09 p.m. The police finally arrive. Every minute that passed was a greater distance. Every second wasted was a lost clue. Witnesses offered confusing fragments. Someone saw a child getting into a light-colored car. Another swore they saw a man holding a small girl's hand, but it looked normal, natural, like a father taking his daughter away. No one paid enough attention because nothing in that scene seemed wrong until it was too late. The ice cream cart's bell kept jingling in the distance, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding. The smell of sunscreen and salt water was still in the air, but Luisa had been sucked out of that perfect scene as if she had never existed. When the police arrived, they asked mechanical questions, wrote down vague descriptions, promised to do their best. But their faces already told the truth. Ernesto and Mariela didn't want to accept yet. In a city that registered disappearances almost daily, finding a child taken in broad daylight would be like looking for a specific star in an infinite sky. The sun began to set over Acapulco. The sky took on shades of orange and pink that contrasted cruelly with the despair settling on the sand of that beach. Families gathered their things and left, casting pitying glances at that shattered couple who remained there, calling for a daughter who no longer answered. Ernesto held the pink shell Luisa had found hours before. His hands trembled. Mariela cried convulsively, her dress still wet with seawater, now mixed with tears. And then he arrived. Ricardo, the family's longtime friend, almost an uncle to Luisa, present at birthdays, barbecues, Sunday afternoons. He appeared breathless, as if he had run upon receiving the news, and immediately wrapped Ernesto in a tight hug. "We will find her," he said, with a conviction that seemed comforting. "I swear we will find her." No one noticed how he avoided looking directly at the photo of Luisa that Mariela held in her hands. No one noticed how his questions about what had happened were excessively detailed, as if checking exactly what the police knew. No one questioned why he had arrived at the beach so quickly, when he was supposedly on the other side of town. They were just small oddities, micro-signals that would get lost amidst the chaos of that afternoon. Because how do you suspect someone who is there, by your side, holding your hand, organizing searches, putting up posters, participating in vigils? How do you suspect someone who cries with you? As night fell completely over Acapulco, the beach emptied. Only Ernesto, Mariela, and a small group of friends and family remained there, as if their simple presence could bring Luisa back. Ricardo was among them, silent now, staring at the dark sea. No one knew that, at that exact moment, Luisa was already more than 60 kilometers away. No one knew that one of the people present on that beach had lied about where he went that day. No one imagined it would take 13 years, a cold case review, and a single forgotten detail for the truth to finally emerge from the shadows. And when it emerged, it would be more painful than anyone could imagine. Because on that night in 1997, while everyone swore to do everything to find Luisa, a single person there knew exactly what had happened to her, and for 13 years no one would dare suspect him. The monster wasn't hidden in the shadows. He was there under the candlelight of the vigil, hugging the shattered family. Inside the house, inside the circle of trust, invisible precisely because he was so close. Subscribe to discover how a stubborn investigator unearthed the secret that had been hidden for 13 years, and how the most unsuspected person became the center of the most painful investigation Acapulco has ever seen. When a child disappears, the first 48 hours are crucial, but when the investigation itself becomes a battlefield, between a stubborn detective and a system that needs quick results for headlines, those 48 hours turn into 13 years of silence. And when the culprit is actively helping in the search, organizing vigils, hugging the shattered parents, he isn't just hiding a crime, he is rewriting history in real time. Detective Miguel Herrera was 46 years old, 22 of them dedicated to the Acapulco police, and had a 7-year-old daughter waiting for him at home every night. When he first looked at the photo of Luisa Flores, that 8-year-old girl smiling with a shell in her hand, he saw his own daughter's face reflected in that smile. That was the first time the case stopped being just a number in the system. Monday, January 20th, 1997, 8:15 a.m. The investigation room smelled of reheated coffee and old paper. A noisy ceiling fan spun too slowly to make a difference in the heat. That was already rising at 8 in the morning. Miguel arrived with the first reports from the beach scattered on his desk. Confused witnesses, contradictory descriptions, times that didn't match. A light car leaving the parking lot. Or was it grey? Or beige? A man holding a child's hand? Or were there 2 children? Memories were already fading like footprints in the sand. "Herrera, I need you in my office." Captain Dominguez was sitting behind a desk covered in newspapers, all with the same headline: "Girl disappears in broad daylight on Acapulco beach." "The press is all over this," Dominguez said without looking at Miguel. "The governor wants an answer, fast. I need a suspect by the end of the week. Captain, this takes time. We need—" "You have 3 days, Herrera. 3. Miguel left the room, knowing he was fighting on 2 fronts, against whoever took Luisa and against a system that prioritized headlines over the truth. Tuesday, January 21st, 2:30 p.m. Miguel set up a makeshift operations room on the 3rd floor, map of Acapulco taped to the wall, red pins marking the last places Luisa was seen: the beach, the ice cream cart, the parking lot. 3 points forming a straight line toward the exit of the tourist zone. Whoever had taken her knew that route well. He sent a request for analysis of the few security camera images. Response: lab delayed by 6 weeks. Case in queue. He asked for phone records from towers near the beach. Response: court warrant. Needed. Process takes 60 to 90 days. He requested additional staff to search the expanded area. Response: no budget available. Maintain current team. Miguel slammed his hand on the desk. The fan kept spinning, indifferent to his frustration. Wednesday, January 22nd, 11:00 a.m. The first lines of investigation appeared too quickly. A street vendor with a history of petty crimes. A taxi driver seen circling the area. A foreign tourist who left his hotel abruptly. The media latched onto these names as if they were certainties. Dominguez summoned Miguel again. I heard we have 3 suspects. Great. Bring one of them in. Captain, we're still verifying alibis. Then verify faster, Herrera. The governor is holding a press conference tomorrow. I need to give him something concrete. Miguel felt the knot tightening. Political pressure was turning the investigation into theater. Thursday, January 23rd, 4:20 p.m. Miguel interviewed the street vendor in a room with no air conditioning. The man was sweating, nervous, hands trembling. I didn't do anything. I sell popsicles, that's all. Where were you at 2:25 p.m. on Sunday? At the beach, where I always am. Can anyone confirm? The man listed 6 names. Miguel checked each one. Everyone confirmed. The taxi driver had a record of 3 fares at that time, all far from the beach. The tourist showed a plane ticket bought weeks earlier. One by one, the easy suspects collapsed. Dominguez wasn't happy. Then find others, Herrera. It can't be that hard. Miguel held back the answer he wanted to give and went back to work. Friday, January 24th, 7:45 p.m. There was a vigil in the central square. Hundreds of people with lit candles, posters with Luisa's face, prayers murmured in unison. Miguel went not to participate but to observe. Old technique. Sometimes the responsible person appears exactly where you should be looking. And there was Ricardo, in the center of the square, holding a megaphone, leading chants, distributing posters, tears streaming down his face as he spoke about bringing our girl back. Ernesto and Mariela were beside him, leaning on him as if he were the only anchor in a sea of despair. Miguel observed, made a mental note. Ricardo, close friend, very involved, verify. But it was just one note among dozens. Tuesday, January 28th, 10:05 a.m. Miguel finally got the security camera images. Terrible quality, grainy, shaky, black and white. But at 2:26 p.m. he saw something. A figure walking through the parking lot, small silhouette beside it, light dress, could be yellow. The adult hand rested on the child's shoulder. Didn't drag, didn't carry, just guided, like a father with his daughter. Too natural to arouse suspicion. Miguel tried to enlarge the image, tried to identify the car. The license plate was obscured by a sun reflection. He punched the desk. So close, so far. Thursday, January 30th, 3:30 p.m. Miguel reviewed every statement, looking for something everyone had missed. A neighbor of the Flores family mentioned, almost casually, that Ricardo had offered several times to take Luisa to a distant park in the days prior to the disappearance. Miguel stopped, reread that. Did he insist a lot? He asked when he went to interview her again. The woman hesitated, fidgeting nervously with her hands. I don't want to cause trouble. Ricardo is so dear to the family. Ma'am, this could be important. Yes, he insisted. I thought it was strange at the time, but he seemed so genuine. Miguel circled that information in the report. When he took it to his superiors, Dominguez flipped through it without interest. Family friend helping is normal, Herrera, not suspicious. Bring me something solid or I'll have to reassign you. Saturday, February 8th, 9 p.m. Miguel went to dinner at the Flores house. It wasn't protocol, but he needed to understand the dynamic, see who gravitated around that wounded family. Ricardo was there, of course, serving coffee, organizing posters, asking questions, many questions. Detective, did you check the roads to the north? What about that abandoned motel on the way out of town? Did the gas station cameras work that day? Specific questions, almost excessively specific, as if he were checking exactly what the police knew. Miguel took another sip of coffee and asked casually, "Ricardo, where were you on Sunday when Luisa disappeared?" "At home, detective. I had a headache, spent the whole day resting." Ricardo answered without hesitation, looking directly into Miguel's eyes. "When I heard what happened, I came straight to the beach." Miguel nodded, thanked him, left. That night, he filled out the request for phone records focused on Ricardo. The request was denied due to lack of sufficient evidence for invasion of privacy. March 1997, 6 weeks. The case began to slip from the news, pushed by new crimes, new tragedies. The operations room was dismantled. Miguel received new cases, but at night, when he went home and saw his daughter sleeping, he would open Luisa's dossier and look at that photo. "I won't forget you," he promised silently. Ricardo remained present in the Flores' lives, almost every day. Miguel saw him sometimes, leaving their house, carrying grocery bags, hugging Mariela at the door, the perfect friend, the unwavering support, and Miguel, driving slowly down the street on that rainy March night, crossed paths with Ricardo and felt for the first time that chill on the back of his neck that experienced detectives learn not to ignore. Something didn't add up. But without proof, without resources, without support, that feeling was nothing more than a shapeless shadow. Shadow that would take 13 years to finally gain body. Want to know what happens when this shadow finally turns into concrete evidence? Subscribe to follow how, years later, a single forgotten detail will blow up the facade of a man everyone called a friend. There is a silent cruelty in not knowing. It is worse than the pain of loss, because pain has an end, a place where you can cry and eventually rebuild. But the absence of answers, that is a wound that never heals. And for the Flores family, every day of the next 13 years would be just a new layer of salt on this open wound. 5 years later. Luisa's room remained untouched, the bed perfectly made with the teddy bear blanket she had chosen when she was 6. The pink shell still rested on the bedside table, now covered by a fine layer of dust that Mariela cleaned religiously every Friday. It was the only day of the week she managed to enter there without falling apart completely. Ernesto had stopped entering the room 3 years ago. He said he couldn't breathe in there, that the walls closed in around him like a coffin. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He had given up waiting. The case was officially closed in March 2002, with a 2-page bureaucratic report that used words like exhaustion of diligence and impossibility of proceeding, as if a child could be reduced to police jargon, as if Luisa's life was worth only 2 typed pages on letterhead. Mariela read that document in the kitchen, alone, on a rainy afternoon. She read every word 3 times, trying to find something between the lines that indicated hope. She found nothing. When Ernesto arrived from work that night, she was sitting in the dark, the paper still in her hand. "They gave up on her," was all she managed to say. Ernesto didn't answer. He just sat beside his wife and for the first time in 5 years cried. Not the silent crying that had become customary, but deep sobs that came from a place he had tried to keep locked. The marriage was already cracked. That was the day the crack turned into an abyss. 8 years later. The house that was once full of life now looked like a museum dedicated to grief. Ernesto worked double shifts at the hotel, anything not to have to return to those walls that echoed with unanswered questions. Mariela had asked for indefinite leave from school. How could she teach children the age Luisa would be now? They barely spoke. When they spoke, they fought. "You gave up on her," Mariela screamed on one of those impossible nights. "She's gone, Mariela. She's not coming back," Ernesto replied, words coming out like broken glass. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. Friends stopped visiting. People don't know what to say to someone living in a grief without a body, without a funeral, without closure. So they simply stop trying. Ricardo had also gradually pulled away. After years of organizing searches, pasting posters, accompanying the family to police stations, he started appearing less. First once a week, then once a month. Then only on important dates. Luisa's birthday, the day of the disappearance. "He has his life too," Mariella defended, when Ernesto commented on the distancing. "He was the only one who still seemed to care," Ernesto murmured. Neither realized that Ricardo's distancing wasn't a coincidence. It was calculation. 11 years later. Miguel Herrera was sitting in a cheap bar near the precinct, staring at a glass of tequila he didn't have the courage to drink. He had stopped drinking 3 years earlier, when he realized he was using alcohol to erase memories that refused to disappear. Luisa's photo was still in his drawer at work, yellowed, faded, but there. He had been transferred twice since 2002, always asking to take the dossier with him. His colleagues thought it was strange. "Let it go. Herrera, you did what you could." But what he could had never been enough. His own daughter was 17 now, about to enter university. Every time he saw her leave the house, a part of him still thought of Luisa, frozen forever at 8 years old in the photo he carried. He had reviewed that case hundreds of times over the years, always returning to that detail that bothered him. Ricardo. The friend present too much, the questions too specific, the convenient withdrawal after the case went cold, but without proof, without resources, without support. That was nothing more than intuition. And intuition didn't arrest anyone. 12 years later, Mariella woke up every day at 5:47 a.m. Not because the alarm rang, not because she had something to do, but because it was the exact time Luisa used to wake up when she was 8, jumping on her parents' bed and asking for pancakes. She created rituals to survive. Every Friday, clean the room. Every Sunday, light a candle on the balcony facing the sea. Every January 19th, go to the beach and stand there, in the same spot where everything had fallen apart. People in the neighborhood started to whisper. She went crazy with grief. Some said, "Must have been something in the family. No one searches that hard if they aren't guilty," others said. The cruelest rumors came from the most unexpected places, that Luisa had run away from home, that the parents had been negligent, that there were secrets hidden in that too perfect family. Mariella heard and pretended not to hear, but every whisper was a stab in a wound that no longer bled, just hurt. Ernesto had moved out. Not officially. He still paid the house bills, still kept some clothes in the closet, but he slept in a tiny apartment near the hotel, unable to continue, sharing that space with the ghost of a girl who would never grow old. Divorce was imminent, just another bureaucracy neither had the energy to start. 13 years later. The city had changed. Acapulco was no longer the postcard paradise of the 90s. Violence had escalated, turning tourist. Beaches into disputed territories. New disappearances happened with frightening frequency. Luisa was just another name on an increasingly long list of people who had simply vanished. Her face on faded posters still appeared occasionally on old poles, but most of the city no longer remembered. 13 years is long enough for a tragedy to turn into a statistic. Mariella was 52 years old and looked 70. Ernesto had developed ulcers and heart problems. Miguel was 3 years away from retirement, carrying a drawer full of unsolved cases like crosses on his back. Ricardo, curiously, was doing well. He had opened a small business in another neighborhood, married, 2 children, visited the florist once a year, always on Luisa's birthday with flowers and kind words. "I will never forget her," he said, hugging Mariella. And it was true, he would never forget, for very different reasons than everyone imagined. On that 13th anniversary of the disappearance, with the sun setting over the same beach where it all began, Mariella lit a candle and said the same prayer she had been saying for 13 years. Just let me know what happened. Just that. Just the truth. She didn't know that. In a forgotten drawer in a police station on the other side of town, a request for review of cold cases was about to be approved. She didn't know that Miguel, even after all those years, had never really put the case aside. And she had no idea that the truth she had begged for 13 years was so close, and would be more devastating than any nightmare she could have imagined. Because sometimes, the answer you search for during years is hidden exactly where you would never think to look. Inside the circle of trust. Inside the house itself. Inside the hug of a friend. The truth was about to emerge from the shadows. Subscribe to discover how a single forgotten detail, 13 years later, would finally put the right name at the center of the investigation and forever destroy the image of the man everyone considered a hero. 13 years. 4,745 days. 113,180 hours of perfectly kept lies, a whole life built on the secret of a single crime. Ricardo had been the perfect friend, the family's comfort, the man who cried beside the shattered parents. But in 2010, a cold case review program and technology that didn't exist in 1997 were about to do something Ricardo never imagined possible. Put his phone exactly where he swore never to have been. September 2010. Miguel Herrera was 2.5 years from retirement when the envelope arrived at his desk. A federal cold case review program, created in response to international pressure on impunity in Mexico, was selecting experienced investigators to re-examine unsolved crimes using new technologies. He opened the envelope with hands that were no longer as steady as in 1997. Read the instructions. Integrated databases. Digital cross-referencing of information. Access to historical phone records that could now be recovered and analyzed. Tools that simply didn't exist 13 years ago. Miguel didn't hesitate. Accepted that same afternoon. Monday, October 4th, 2010. 9:30 a.m. The archives room smelled of mold and yellowed paper. Piles and piles of dusty boxes, each containing stories of unsolved crimes, interrupted lives, destroyed families. Miguel began to review, box by box, looking for cases that could benefit from the new tools. It was almost by chance that he found it. Luisa Flores's folder was stuck between 2 homicide cases from 1998. Yellowed. Too thin for a life that had disappeared. Her photo was still stapled to the first page. That smile that had haunted Miguel for 13 years. He sat in an old chair that creaked under his weight and opened the dossier slowly, as if afraid the words might have changed, as if he expected to find something different this time. But they were the same pages, the same statements, the same clues leading nowhere. Except now, he had something he didn't have before. Time, perspective, and technology. Wednesday, October 13th, 2:15 p.m. Miguel spent the first few days scanning every page of the dossier, creating a digital database where he could cross-reference information, flag inconsistencies, map timelines. He was meticulous to the point of obsession, reviewing every detail as if it were the first time. It was upon rereading the statements that something jumped out at him. Ricardo had said he was at home on the day of the disappearance with a headache all day, that he only found out what happened when a neighbor called and then went straight to the beach. But a witness, the neighbor who mentioned Ricardo's insistence on taking Luisa to the park, had said she saw him leaving by car around noon. Miguel had flagged that inconsistency in 1997, but without resources to dig deeper, it had remained just a footnote. Now, he had resources. Friday, October 22nd, 11 a.m. Miguel filled out the requisition for access to historical phone records. With the new federal program, approval came in. 3 days, something that in 1997 would have taken months if it came at all. When the data arrived, Miguel spent a whole night reviewing every line. And then he saw it. January 19th, 1997, 2:17 p.m. Ricardo's phone connected to a transmission tower located 68 kilometers north of Acapulco on the Tiu highway leading to the interior of the state. 2:31 p.m. New connection, same tower. 2:52 p.m. Connection to an even more distant tower, 82 kilometers away. 3:23 p.m. 4-minute call to an unidentified number. 4:10 p.m. Return, transmission tower near Acapulco. 6:45 p.m. Call to the Flores house. Miguel felt his heart race for the first time in years. Ricardo wasn't at home with a headache. He was on the road driving north, precisely in the hours following Luisa's disappearance. Exactly when a girl in a yellow dress was being taken far from the beach. But there was more. Monday, October 29th. 8 coups. Miguel requested access to historical bank records. Again, approval came quickly. The federal program had opened doors that previously remained locked for investigators like him. Ricardo's bank statements from February 1997 showed something disturbing: a deposit of 45,000 Mexican pesos, approximately 3 months' salary of an average worker at the time, credited on February 12, 1997. Origin: international transfer. Sender: corporate account of a tourism company registered in the Cayman Islands. Miguel investigated the company. Paper: a front, created 3 months before the deposit, dissolved 6 months later. Ricardo, who always complained of financial difficulties, suddenly had enough money to open his own business 2 months after Luisa's disappearance. The pieces were starting to fit together in a nauseating way. Wednesday, November 3rd, 8:30 p.m. Miguel created a visual timeline on the wall of his small makeshift office. December 1996. Ricardo begins to offer insistently to take Luisa places alone. January 19th, 1997, 2:23 p.m. Luisa disappears from the beach. January 19th, 2:17 p.m., 4:10 p.m. Ricardo's phone tracked more than 68 kilohertz from Acapulco in the opposite direction to where he declared. February 12th, 1997, suspicious deposit of 45,000 pesos. March-August 1997, Ricardo extremely present, organizing searches, vigils, always asking specific details about the investigation. 2002, 2010, gradual distancing as the case cools and is archived. Miguel took a step back and looked at it. It wasn't intuition anymore, it was a pattern pointing to the man who had free access to the girl, who knew her routine, who had the family's absolute trust, the man who was on the road exactly when Luisa disappeared while swearing to be at home, the man who received a significant sum of money weeks later, the friend, the confidant, the monster hiding in plain sight. Friday, November 5th, 9:02 a.m. Miguel scheduled a meeting with the new case review prosecutor's office. He took the entire reconstructed dossier, the charts, the phone records, the bank statements. "I want to officially reopen the Luisa Flores case," he said, "and I want authorization to investigate Ricardo Mendoza as the main suspect." There was initial resistance. After all, it was 13 years. Ricardo was a respected citizen, had a family, established business, but the data was undeniable. The prosecutor, a 40-year-old woman named Elena Vargas, reviewed every page in silence. When she finished, she looked at Miguel with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "I should have been sure about this 13 years ago," Miguel replied. Elena nodded slowly. "I'll authorize the reopening. But Herrera, you know this will destroy that family all over again, don't you? Finding out the responsible person was beside them all this time." "I know," Miguel said, his voice heavy. "But they deserve the truth, no matter how much it hurts." Monday, November 8th, 10:15 a.m. Miguel drove to the Flores house. He had rehearsed the words 1,000 times, but knew none would be enough. Mariela opened the door. She was 52 years old, but looked to have aged decades. When she saw Miguel, her eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear. "Detective Herrera? I need to talk to you and Ernesto," Miguel said gently. "Luisa's case is officially being reopened." Mariela brought her hand to her mouth. Immediate tears. Did you find something?" "We did," Miguel said. "But I need you to prepare yourselves. What I have to tell, you will be very difficult to hear." That was when Ernesto appeared behind her. The two looked at Miguel with that expression of someone who has spent 13 years waiting for that moment, and, at the same time, fearing it. "It's about someone close to you," Miguel began carefully. "Someone you trusted completely." And as he spoke the name, Ricardo Mendoza, he saw that couple's world crumble for the second time. Because finding out your daughter was taken is a tragedy, but finding out she was taken by someone you loved, that is a betrayal that destroys everything you thought you knew about the world. The truth emerged from the shadows after 13 years, but now comes the hardest part, proving it. Subscribe to discover how Miguel and the team will conduct the investigation that will finally lead Ricardo to fall, and how the final confrontation will reveal the full horror of what happened on that day in 1997. There are two types of liars: those who stumble over their own words when confronted, and those who spent 13 years rehearsing every answer, every expression, every tear. Ricardo Mendoza was the second type. But in November 2010, for the first time in over a decade, he would be forced to improvise. And when professional liars improvise, they make mistakes. Fatal mistakes. Wednesday, November 10th, 2010, 6:15 a.m. The operation was planned with surgical precision. Miguel led a team of 6 investigators, 2 court officers, and an assistant prosecutor. 3 unmarked cars parked discreetly 2 blocks from Ricardo's house in the middle-class neighborhood where he had built his respectable life. A life financed, Miguel now knew, by the blood-stained money that arrived in February 1997. Elena Vargas, the prosecutor, reviewed the documents one last time. Search and seizure warrants, authorization for formal interrogation, asset freeze order, everything meticulously prepared so there would be no legal loophole. "He can't know we're coming," Elena said. "If he destroyed evidence over these years, he might have kept something, anything." Miguel nodded. He had spent the last few nights sleepless, reviewing every detail, every possibility. There would be no second chance. At 6:15 a.m., they knocked on the door. 6:17 a.m. Ricardo opened the door, still in pajamas, hair disheveled, face showing genuine surprise. Or almost genuine, Miguel already knew. That face well enough to detect the microsecond of calculation in his eyes before the mask of confusion installed itself completely. "Detective Herrera?" "What?" "Ricardo Mendoza. We have a search and seizure warrant authorized by the federal judge." Miguel showed the documents. "I need you to step away from the door and allow our entry." For an instant, just an instant, Ricardo stood motionless. His eyes darted rapidly down the street, as if measuring distances, calculating escapes. But there were patrol cars at both ends of the block. "Of course," he said, forcing a shaky smile. "But what is this about?" "It's about Luisa Flores," Miguel answered, observing every micro-expression, "and about where you really were on January 19th, 1997. Ricardo's face paled. Just for a second. Then the mask returned. "I already said everything I knew years ago," he protested, as the investigators entered and began to methodically search every room. "You lied years ago," Miguel corrected calmly, "and today we are going to correct that." 8:30 a.m. The search revealed disturbing fragments, newspaper clippings about Luisa's disappearance, kept in a box at the back of a closet. Old photos of the girl, some that Miguel hadn't seen even in the original dossier, as if Ricardo had kept private copies. A notebook with notes dated 1997 and 1998, including references to risks and precautions necessary. And, hidden in a built-in safe behind a bookshelf, discovered only because one of the investigators noticed the wall sounded hollow. Bank documents from offshore accounts, international transfers, and a series of printed emails from 1997 exchanged with addresses that no longer existed. Elena photographed each item meticulously. "This is enough to take him for formal interrogation," she told Miguel. Ricardo, sitting in the living room under the supervision of 2 officers, watched with an expression increasingly difficult to maintain. "Ricardo Mendoza, you are detained for interrogation related to the disappearance of Luisa Flores in 1997, Miguel announced. "You have the right to remain silent and to a lawyer." "I didn't do anything," Ricardo said, but his voice had lost its firmness. "Then you will have the opportunity to explain the phone records that place you 68 kilometers from Acapulco at the exact moment you swore to be at home," Miguel replied. Ricardo closed his eyes. Central Station, 2 p.m. The interrogation room was small, windowless, lit by a fluorescent light that buzzed irritatingly. Miguel sat across from Ricardo, who was now accompanied by a clearly nervous lawyer. "My client denies any involvement," the lawyer began. Then client needs to explain some inconsistencies," Elena interrupted, opening a folder and spreading documents on the table. First, the phone records, tower by tower, time by time. You said you were home. Your phone says you were on the road. Second, the bank deposit, 45,000 pesos, 3 weeks after. The disappearance, where did this money come from? Third, the photos and clippings. Why would a family friend keep all this hidden for 13 years? Fourth, revisited witnesses. 3 people now confirm that you insisted repeatedly to be alone with Luisa in the weeks prior. Ricardo was sweating. His hands trembled slightly. The lawyer whispered something in his ear. I might have gotten confused about where I was that day, Ricardo tried. It's been so long. You got confused about being 68 kilometers north when a child disappeared. Miguel leaned forward. That is your story? Silence. Elena continued, relentless. We also have testimony from a former hotel employee on the highway who remembers a man with your physical description stopping there on January 19th, 1997, agitated, asking to use the phone. Ricardo closed his eyes again. His hands now trembled visibly. Ricardo, Miguel said, his voice suddenly softer, more human. You lived with this family for 13 years. You saw what this did to them. You saw Mariela, aged 30 years in 10. You saw Ernesto fall apart. Are you really going to keep lying? For a long moment, Ricardo remained silent. Then, slowly his defenses began to crumble. I didn't want it to happen that way, he whispered. The lawyer tried to interrupt him, but Ricardo continued, words coming out like a confession, accumulated over more than a decade. I was in financial trouble. Lots of debts. Someone offered me money. A lot of money just to facilitate. Facilitate what? Elena asked, her voice cold as ice. To get the girl away from the beach, take her to a specific place, hand her over. The room went absolutely silent. To whom? Miguel asked. Ricardo shook his head. I don't know. Never knew. Everything was done through intermediaries, phones that no longer exist, disposable emails. You knew her since she was born, Miguel said, fighting to keep his voice controlled. She trusted you. I know, Ricardo whispered, tears now streaming down his face. Not of remorse, Miguel realized, but of self-pity. I thought it would be quick, that I would forget, but you had to keep living with the family, Elena completed. Had to look in their eyes, participate in the searches, cry beside them, all while knowing. Ricardo covered his face with his hands. 5 p.m. In the next room, behind a mirrored glass, Ernesto and Mariela had heard every word. Elena had offered the possibility, warning it would be unbearable. They insisted. They needed to hear. They needed to know. Mariela collapsed when Ricardo confessed, not from pain of loss, that pain she had carried for 13 years, but from betrayal, from understanding that the man who had held her hand at vigils, who had cried at her table, who had helped search for her daughter, was the same man who had handed her over. Ernesto simply stood motionless, his face turned to stone. When he finally moved, it was to hug his wife, and for the first time in years they cried together, not just for the lost daughter but for the destroyed innocence, the betrayed trust, the monster that had lived beside them for so long. 7:30 p.m. Ricardo was formally charged with participation in the disappearance and possible trafficking of Luisa Flores, conspiracy, concealment of evidence, perjury. The list of charges was long and devastating. Miguel watched as he was led away, handcuffed, to the holding cell. 13 years. It had taken 13 years for that moment to arrive. But even with the confession, one question remained unanswered. Where was Luisa? Ricardo swore he didn't know, said he had handed her over and never heard anything again. Whether he was telling the truth or keeping one last secret, no one could be sure. Finally, after 13 years, the mask fell. But the journey isn't over yet. Subscribe for the final chapter and discover how justice, although late, transformed a family's pain into a legacy, and how the Luisa Flores case changed forever the way Acapulco would investigate disappearances. Justice has a cruel stopwatch. 13 years is enough time for a child to become an adult, for parents to age decades, for hopes to die and be reborn as scars. But when the truth finally emerges, even after so long, it carries something powerful. Proof that time does not erase crimes and that some promises are never forgotten. Superior Court of Justice of Guerrero, March 2011. The courtroom was packed. Journalists occupied the front rows, cameras positioned strategically to capture every moment. Human rights activists and families of other disappeared persons filled the remaining seats, turning that trial into something much bigger than the case of a single girl. It was a symbol, a precedent, a message that cold cases could and should be reopened. Mariela and Ernesto sat side by side for the first time in years. They hadn't gone back to living together, probably never would, but Luisa's case had reconnected them in a strange and painful way. United not by love anymore, but by the search for justice for the daughter they had lost 13 years before. Miguel sat behind them, in a suit he rarely wore, hands clasped on his lap. He had testified for 3 days, presenting every piece of meticulously collected evidence, the phone records, the bank statements, the contradictions, the confessions. Ricardo entered handcuffed, escorted by 2 guards. He had aged visibly in the 4 months since his arrest, hair whiter, face thinner, shoulders hunched, as if finally carrying the real weight of what he had done. When his eyes briefly crossed Mariela's, he looked away immediately. There were no more masks. There were no more rehearsed tears. Just the naked and brutal reality of his betrayal. Day 3 of the trial. Testimony of Ernesto Flores. "He was like a brother to me," Ernesto said, his voice breaking. "When Luisa disappeared, he was one of the first people to arrive. He hugged me, cried with me, organized searches, and all this time, during all these years..." His voice failed. He couldn't finish. Prosecutor Elena Vargas didn't press. Let the silence speak for itself. Let the court absorb the magnitude of the betrayal. Day 5. Testimony of Mariela Flores. "I kept her room untouched for 13 years, Mariela testified, tears flowing freely. "Every Friday I cleaned, talked to her, asked her to send me a sign of where she was." She looked directly at Ricardo. "And you were there, at the vigils, at the birthdays. You held my hand and told me everything would be fine. You knew where she was, you always knew, and you let us suffer anyway." Ricardo kept his eyes down, said nothing. There was nothing to say. Day 8. Sentencing. Judge Martinez, a 62-year-old man with a 3-decade career, reviewed the records with a grave expression. "Ricardo Mendoza," he began, his voice echoing through the silent room, "you have been found guilty of participation in enforced disappearance, conspiracy for trafficking of a minor, concealment of evidence, perjury, and obstruction of justice." Every word fell like a hammer. "Your actions not only destroyed an innocent child, but prolonged for 13 years the unimaginable suffering of a family that trusted you. You exploited that trust in a calculated and cruel manner, staying close to the victims to monitor the investigation and ensure your participation remained hidden." The judge paused, looking directly at Ricardo. "This court sentences you to 35 years in prison, without the possibility of parole for the first 20 years. Additionally, all your assets will be confiscated and reverted to a compensation fund for the Flores family and organizations supporting families of the disappeared." The room exploded in murmurs. Mariela covered her face with her hands, but she wasn't crying. For the first time in 13 years, she was breathing. April 2011, 3 weeks after sentencing. Miguel met with Mariela and Ernesto in a quiet cafe, away from the media. Spotlight. They ordered coffee, but no one drank. "Thank you," Mariela said simply. "I know you never gave up, even when everyone else did." Miguel shook his head. "I should have found out sooner. I should have..." "You did what was possible with what you had," Ernesto interrupted. "And when you had the chance 13 years later, you didn't let it pass. That is what matters." "We still don't know where she is," Mariela said quietly. It was the question that hung over all of them. Ricardo had confessed his role, but insisted he didn't know Luisa's final destination. "Maybe we never will," Miguel admitted. "But now you have something you didn't have before, the truth about who and how, and a culprit paying for it." It wasn't perfect closure, but it was closure. June 2011. The Luisa Flores case transformed into something bigger than a family or a city. It became a paradigmatic case, used in investigator training throughout Mexico. The Flores case came to be studied in police academies, highlighting the importance of looking within inner circles, of not discarding suspicions based on appearances of trust, and of never ever closing a case just because immediate clues ran out. Miguel was invited to speak at criminal investigation conferences. He always started the same way. It took 13 years. 13 years during which a family suffered, a criminal lived free, and justice seemed impossible. But technology changes, systems improve, and if there is someone willing not to forget, the truth can emerge. August 2012, Miguel's retirement. At the small farewell party at the precinct, Miguel received a plaque of honor, but the gift that meant the most was another. Mariela and Ernesto appeared, bringing a framed photo of Luisa. That photo from the beach, the smile, the shell. "So you remember," Mariela said, "that some promises are worth keeping for 13 years. Miguel put the photo in his living room. Beside it, eventually, others would come. Because the Flores case had inspired the reopening of dozens of cold investigations. And Miguel, even retired, became a volunteer consultant, helping other families find their own delayed truths. January 2013. 16 years after the disappearance, Mariela and Ernesto created the Luisa Flores Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families of the disappeared and pushing for reviews of cold cases. They held monthly vigils on the same beach where Luisa had disappeared, no longer just to remember her, but to give voice to hundreds of other disappeared persons whose cases gathered dust in forgotten archives. "Luisa won't come back," Mariela said in an interview. "But if her story can prevent other families from living 13 years without answers, then her life and her loss will have had meaning." Ernesto, by her side, added, "Delayed justice is still justice, and as long as there is a cold case, there will be hope that the truth can emerge." Epilogue, 2014. Ricardo was serving his sentence in a medium-security prison. In 3 years, he had aged 2 decades. No one from his old life visited him. Not family, not friends. He had lost everything: freedom, reputation, years of life. But for many, including Miguel, that still seemed insufficient given what he had taken from Luisa and her family. The question about Luisa's final whereabouts remained unanswered. Perhaps it always would. But her story was not in vain. Dozens of cases were reopened. New technologies were implemented. Protocols were revised, and families who had given up hope began to receive it back. One renewed investigation at a time. Miguel, at 64, looked out the window of his house overlooking the sea. Luisa's photo was on the wall. Beside it, photos of other cases he had helped solve after retiring. He had kept his promise. Not in the way he would have liked, not in the time he expected, but he had kept it. And sometimes when the sun set over Acapulco, dyeing the sky orange and pink, he thought of that 8-year-old girl with a shell in her hand and whispered softly, "We didn't forget you, Luisa. We never will." The story of Luisa Flores reminds us that the truth, even after 13 years, still matters, that cold cases can be solved, that the persistence of an investigator and the resilience of a family can change the system. If you know someone living without answers about a missing person, share this story. Delayed justice is still justice, and hope, even after decades, is still worth it.